Voter fraud, outside interference, tampering with ballots. These are a few of the fearful things when it comes to electing the President of the United States electors have. No, we are not here to look at the upcoming 2020 election or even 2016's election. Rather, we are rewinding history's tape to look back to 1876. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan. I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. My guest for this conversation is Mr. George Deutsch, historian, author, and executive director of the Hagen History Center. A bit about George: he is the co-founder. He's co-founded several historical organizations related to the Civil War and the War of 1812 in Erie. He's also helped to create the flagship Niagara League, which played a central role in reconstructing the U.S. brig Niagara and creating the Erie Maritime Museum. An historian and author, he annually teaches courses at the Chautauqua Institution, and for more than 3 decades has given numerous presentations on Civil War history across 7 states, as well as the District of Columbia. He has been published in numerous journals and also served as a consultant to National Geographic magazine for its Civil War sesquicentennial issue. He earned a degree in history from Mercyhurst University and was also educated at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And of course, he's no stranger to the Jefferson stage, as he's presented on a range of topics, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Civil War to the great antagonists, President Lincoln and Chief Justice Taney, and contentious presidential elections, which is what we're going to focus on here. Yes, today the very validity of our presidential elections has been called into question, but whether we say it repeats or echoes, history is here to teach us something about these concerns. In the course of the United States history, other elections have had allegations of election fraud and corrupt deals, but none more so than the election of 1876, so says our guest. And that election ultimately ended Reconstruction and ushered in the era of disenfranchisement for African Americans in the South. From the campaigns to the cartoons to the outcome, we'll discuss the election and examine how we got there, from the Constitutional Convention to the Electoral College, and what we can stand to learn from history. Now, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we'll work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, please do feel free to send us your questions still, and we will get them along to Mr. Deutsch as best we can. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please visit jeserie.org and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Mr. George Deutsch, thank you for joining me for this conversation today.
Thanks, Ben. You almost sounded like one of those ad guys who has to get 60 seconds of copy in 15 seconds there.
I think we're a little rushed because we got a late start. And again, folks, we apologize for that, but thank you for your patience and sticking by. And I'm looking forward to diving into today's presentation. I've got my screen shared. I have the PowerPoint pulled up. George and I are going to talk through this. I'm going to move through some slides. George, just let me know when you're ready to advance that and we can move on to the next one. But I want to start with the fact that this isn't news. We've heard that 2016 was the most corrupt election in U.S. history. You here say hardly. Where does history point us to agree with that finding?
Well, advance the slide here for me, Ben.
There's your hardly.
There we go. There's my hardly. As you know, and those of you who've seen me at the Jefferson or Chautauqua, I focus on 8 different presidential elections prior to 2000 that were considered very contentious, and 3 of them are perhaps the most legitimate contenders for corrupt. And those are 1824, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson and 2 others, 1876 with Tilden and Hayes, which we will do in depth today, and 1960 Kennedy versus Nixon. I'll quickly go through the other 2 because I think they are certainly legitimate contenders and ones that have, if you're interested, we can always come back and do them again. But the 1824, Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and 1 other, all were contending for the presidency. The front runner actually had a stroke in the middle of the campaign, and so he faded, but he still had quite a bit of the popular vote. But when it came down to the results, Andrew Jackson had 43% of the vote. to John Quincy Adams, 31% of the vote, which was a clear larger amount, but when you factor in everybody else, nobody got to 50%, and the Electoral College was divided. So what happens? Well, the Constitution mandates that it went to the House of Representatives. Who was the Speaker of the House? Henry Clay. And so they had what was later termed as the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay threw his support to John Quincy Adams, and he persuaded other congressmen to do the same. The result is John Quincy Adams won the election, although he was in second place in both the Electoral College and the popular vote. And the corrupt bargain was that he actually was, John Quincy Adams actually named Clay as his Secretary of State. A little bit of quick history. Every Secretary of State since Thomas Jefferson succeeded to the presidency. So it was the stepping stone. So by Adams naming Clay as Secretary of State, it was the launch pad for Clay to become the next president. Well, Jackson, who had a famous temper, spent the next 4 years undermining Adams. Does that sound familiar somehow? And Adams was limited to one term. Clay never won the election himself. So the result of the corrupt bargain was one term of John Quincy Adams, none to Henry Clay, and then ultimately 2 terms to Jackson. Now, we don't have time to go into, we think that some of the ads you're hearing today are bad. They're nothing compared to the ads that were in the newspapers and pamphlets in 1824. Wish we had some time to go into that, but suffice it to say, I've studied presidential elections all the way from college on, and believe me, this one was one of the dirtiest. So let's fast forward until just now, believe it or not, 60 years ago. And that was Kennedy versus Nixon. And it has often been called a stolen election. First of all, the popular vote was razor thin. It was Kennedy received 49.7%, Nixon received 49.6%. The Electoral College, that was a little wider, 303 to 219. But 2 key states are where this one falls into my category of most corrupt. First of all, we have Illinois, the infamous boss, Mayor Daley in Chicago, the Daley machine. Up to this point, then, by the way, there are 27 electoral votes from Illinois at the time. Chicago always led the state in reporting their vote count, but uncharacteristically, Chicago was the last to come in. Basically, Richard Daley held the Chicago vote until the entire rest of the state had reported. And then miraculously, Cook County came in and it put Kennedy over the top by 8,800 votes. The FBI actually had wiretaps about discussions about how they were going to manipulate the vote. So there was no doubt that the 27 votes out of Illinois were clearly stolen. However, that wouldn't have put them over the top. The other state is Texas. Now, Lyndon Johnson, who is the vice president candidate, was involved in multiple shady elections during his time as both congressman and senator from Texas. And the election system was tainted statewide. And ultimately, Kennedy won the popular vote by 46,000. But even Robert Caro, who was a sympathetic who wrote a sympathetic 3-volume biography of Johnson, said that the election results were, quote, uncertain. And so Kennedy's popularity in Texas was so thin, that's actually what prompted the 1963 visit to Dallas, which we all know the tragic results of that. It was 51 votes in the Electoral College. So if you swing those 2 states, you have Richard Nixon winning in the Electoral College by 270 to 252. Now, I think the most amazing part of this whole story with Kennedy versus Nixon was that there was a reporter in the New York Herald by the name of Earl Mazzo. He was an investigative reporter, well known in the country. He started a 12-part series to expose the fraud in the election. And after just 4 of those articles came out, Nixon went to the publisher of the New York Herald, and this is a quote. Nixon says to the publisher, "No one steals the presidency of the United States." And he persuaded the New York Herald to hold the last 8 so as to not throw the results of the election into complete chaos. You know, a lot of people don't like Richard Nixon, and perhaps before his paranoia set in, he did the right thing, I believe, by going to the New York Herald and stopping publication of this. So those are my 2 candidates for other significantly corrupt presidential elections. But the big one, the one we're going to talk about today, which is even more dramatic, is Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. So I think we can go to the next slide.
And George, that's what I was going to say. You called this one the most corrupt. And so I do want to rewind that tape of history to get back to the Constitutional Convention and see how that sets the grounds for what's about to happen in 1876.
So the Constitutional Convention, I say here, the Electoral College for better or worse. And as most of you probably should know now, that we do not elect the president versus a popular vote. We actually elect electors who attend this convention or the Electoral College to cast their votes based on who they were pledged to represent. And this was a compromise in the Constitutional Convention. Constitution was adopted in 1789. And there was a heated debate over the nature of the presidential elections back then. There were those factions that were for the direct popular vote, as there are today. There were a number of people that contended, a number of the delegates contended that unlettered people, swayed by a few active and designing men, did not have the requisite capacity to choose wisely. That's a lot of loaded language, but that was the thought. By the way, if you look at this photograph, you have George Washington, who was president of the convention. You have Benjamin Franklin sitting in front of him. You have James Madison whispering into Franklin's ear. These are some of the great early American fathers.
And George, you mentioned the fact that we don't directly elect our president. I can't help but think of Ben Franklin coming out of the hall, and people say, "Mr. Franklin, what do we have?" And he says, "A republic, if you can keep it. Not a democracy, if you can keep it. A republic."
Right, and that's the difference. Again, same thing with our legislatures, both the House and the Senate. We elect representatives to do the people's business. Every time there's a bill coming for Congress, we don't have an election to say yes or no. Some states like California, you can have a referendum, and others, but we don't do that nationally. We elect people to represent us, which is the essence of what a republic is. So what happens? Well, the Constitutional Convention, was completely divided, and they weren't going to be able to come to a consensus. So they turned it over to what was called the Special Committee on Postponed Matters. And there was a lot of debate in that committee about how to elect the president, and they had a fateful compromise. It became known as the Electoral College. Each state, and again, this is quoting, "in a manner of its own devising," would select electors that would be equal to the total congressional delegation. Now, what does this mean? It means that the big states at that time, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, could not dominate the popular vote or have the most congressional seats and be able to be the only 3 states that really mattered. Today, we refer to those smaller states as flyover country. You get probably out much past 6 or 8 of the big states. If you didn't have the equivalency of the congressional delegation, which includes 2 senators from each state, no matter how small that state is, you would end up being able to campaign in just a handful of the biggest states and still be able to win. This changes the game complexion completely because even the small states have a significant voice. James Madison, who would become the 4th president, is often called the father of the Constitution. He would say the Electoral College was a decision made in part for a degree of the hurrying influence produced by fatigue and impatience. So even Madison did not think it was a perfect solution, but ever since, it's been the Electoral College, the key to shaping the presidential elections and to electing the president. So it's been the, basically it's been the Electoral College for better or worse. So that's a bit more background on why we are where we are, and it also begins to shape the election of 76.
Yeah, and George, the exciting thing about this, at least to me, somebody who does enjoy a political cartoon or two now and again, we see this moment in history giving us our first symbols, the elephant and the donkey, for the Republican and Democratic parties respectively. And this is coming out of that 3rd term panic, and that's really what I'd like for you to unpack. But I think it's interesting to note that the Dems are actually represented by a fox. The donkey, or the jackass, is actually the New York Herald, and we'll get to media in a minute. But anything we should note about the Dems as a fox? And second, elephant for Republicans, that stuck.
It did. And actually, the symbol of the jackass for the Democratic Party goes all the way back to the election of, I believe it was 1828. It could have even been the 24 one, which we spoke about, but I believe it was 28 when one of the opponents of Jackson in the media, because Jackson was running as the Democratic Party presidential nominee, called Jackson a jackass, and it showed him riding on a jackass being led by the Democrat Party. So it goes back much further than this, but the Democrats themselves attempted to try to create a less controversial or back in the 1800s, a jackass was the same thing you think about today. They did not exactly want to be associated with that. So they tried to create the fox as their symbol, but it never stuck. The jackass stuck.
And so here we are with that 3rd term panic. What do we mean here? And let's unpack how this is a foundational part of what gets us to the corrupt nature or the controversial nature or contentious nature of the 1876 election.
Sure. Well, the Republicans had held the presidency and the Congress since the Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant was in his 2nd term. He was certainly the war hero in the North. He was elected to 2 terms, but those terms were marked by growing corruption. I think that it's pretty clear that Grant himself was not a corrupt president, but he did choose badly, putting people around him who took advantage and made money off of his good name and off of his office. Again, something sounding familiar these days. Well, by 1873, we had a panic, which was a depression. It was called a panic back then, but it was a depression. And for the first time in 14 years, the Democrats took back the House of Representatives. They were full of expectations that they would sweep into the presidency and the Senate in 1876. The Republican, there were those in the Republican Party who felt that Grant could get elected a third term. There were a number of Republicans who were very worried about Grant and the corruption, and all these animals that you see in the slide here. You see a sheep, a donkey rather, in a lion's clothing right in the center, and that is represented in this cartoon by the Democrat Party, who are then all of the other animals are different media, different newspapers and whatnot at the time, and the donkey in the lion's outfit is panicking all the press about the possibility that Grant, represented by the elephant, would end up running for a third term. So as it turned out, a number of top Republicans took to that panic and ultimately blocked Grant from running. Grant chose not to run, but he certainly had been contemplating it beforehand. So that sets the stage. Up come two new contenders in the election of 1876. The first one on the left, Rutherford B. Hayes, rather distinguished looking gentleman there. He was a major general in the Civil War. He had unimpeachable integrity, which is one of the reasons he was chosen. He graduated from Harvard Law School. He would become the first president of the United States with a graduate degree, interestingly enough. He was a three-time governor of Ohio. He was a little bit dull personality-wise, and he had a solid but somewhat unremarkable political career. One of the things that kind of clued you in on his dullness was that he and his wife were absolute teetotalers. And they would actually, once he became president, would serve water for state dinners. And particularly the European diplomats hated to go to a dinner in the White House because they couldn't sit there and drink away the evening. So little interesting fact about Hayes. But he was, as I mentioned, he was a Civil War general, and he was a genuine hero. Now contrast him to Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden was a New York City DA, would then become governor of New York, and a foe of corruption. Now, New York was run by the Tammany Hall political machine, Boss Tweed. Tilden had come up in the political machine, but he broke from them, and he became a crusader against political corruption. So he too was one that the Democrats could look and say, look at our guy, he's going to not succumb to the political corruption that Grant had. Tilden was a multimillionaire, and that's when multimillionaires counted for something. He was a corporate lawyer, and he was known as having a brilliant mind. He had this penetrating intellect, which even made his friends uncomfortable. And he was elected in '74 as governor of New York. He was icy, he was aloof, he was a bachelor, he was often unhealthy, and undoubtedly a hypochondriac. He did not fight in the Civil War, which is something that the Republicans would later make a lot of. But he made millions of dollars during the war from providing both railroad services and from his iron mines in New York for manufacturing of weapons and whatnot. So he sat out the war, made millions, and Rutherford B. Hayes was a genuine hero. So that's a bit of the contrast. Hayes is dull, Tilden is icy and aloof, and you've got a real absolute contrast in personalities here.
And so for that, George, then take us into the campaigns. What does that look like for each one of these men?
Okay, well, Tilden, neither one of them was the incumbent, but Tilden was certainly the contender here because the Republicans had run things for so long. So they were, Tilden's campaign was very aggressive. They were confident that they could wrest the presidency from this corrupt party. And in doing so, and we see media pounding at us all day, every day. I don't know how many, I probably get 30 political emails a day in my box these days from both parties. Well, they tried to do the same thing. Obviously, they didn't have the internet, but the Democratic Party put together what was called the Literary Bureau, and it had teams of writers, and they churned out anti-Hayes material all day, every day, including a 750-page book linking him to every real or imagined scandal that was going on in the day. They accused Hayes of stealing from a Union soldier who was about to be executed, when in fact, he did take money from that soldier, but on the promise that he would give it to the soldier's mother, which he did. The last part didn't get into the book. They spread the rumor that Hayes had shot and wounded his mother in a fit of insanity. Actually, the insanity brought on by his excessive drinking. And remember, I mentioned he's a teetotaler. He never let alcohol pass his lips. And his mother by that time was dead, so she couldn't refute the rumor that Hayes had shot and wounded her. And then, of course, we have the problem of Tilden being the icy, aloof bachelor. And so they set up the National Popularity Bureau, and it was the whole, in contrast to the Literary Bureau, which was tearing Hayes down. The Popularity Bureau was set up to portray Tilden in the press as a warm and lovable guy. So so that's some of the personality hits that go on. If we go to the next one, we'll talk a little bit about the counter campaign. This is Rutherford B. Hayes's campaign. First of all, it's going to be too small for you to read it, but on the right-hand side, the cartoon, there's a list touting Hayes as a reformer, and a list of all of these political reforms and social service reforms or civil service reforms that they were going to do. However, it didn't quite happen that way in terms of the reality of the campaign. There is and I'll read you a quote here. The chairman of the Republican Party, who was Zachariah Chandler from Ohio, he was called bewhiskered, bejeweled, and often besotted. Anyway, he kicked off the campaign with a fundraising letter sent to every Republican appointee holding office. Remember, there was no civil service per se. Each time a president came in, they appointed everybody from clerks in the Treasury Department all the way to postmasters. And so the president had a very long and important list of jobs that he could fill. So Chandler sent a letter to fundraising letter to every political appointee, Republican holding office, and this is what his quote was: "We look to you as one of the federal beneficiaries to help bear the burden. 2% of your salary is," and they actually put every individual's salary in there, "please remit promptly. At the close of the campaign, we shall place a list of those who have not paid in the hands of the head of the department that you are now in." So in other words, give them 2% of your salary.
Folks, it looks like we might have lost George there for a minute. My deepest apologies for that. We're going to work quickly to bring him back into this conversation. Stand by and give us 1 minute, please. Thank you. All right, folks, it looks like we've got George back. George, thanks for coming back to us. Sorry we
And,
lost you there for a
and
second.
you and I are absolutely jinxed about all of a sudden my computer just shut off. Sorry, everyone. I apologize for that.
That's quite all right, George. We're just grateful to have you back. Against all odds, we will get through the election of 1876, and so we're going to bring it right back to where we left off. George, you were telling us about Hayes. We had learned about him being a campaign reformer. We were learning about the salary, 2% of the salaries, and then I think that's about where we lost you. So if we can pick
Okay. All
right
right.
up from there, that would be great.
So the campaign, besides, the reality of the campaign, which was corrupt, forcing the civil servants to give part of their salaries. And by the way, this has helped to lead to the civil service reforms within the next decade. But the campaign, they accused Tilden of, because he was a bachelor, he was an easy target for this, of having numerous affairs and this is a quote, contracting syphilis from a Irish Bowery whore. And so again, it obviously got pretty nasty. And then we talk about waving the bloody shirt. And that was actually a campaign tactic that for many years after the Civil War, the Republican Party used against the Democrats. And again, I will read you a quote from one of the men who were campaigning for Hayes. Now, Hayes was too plain and too honest to say some of these things himself. But a writer by the name of Robert Ingersoll, who was one of the campaign surrogates, attacked the Democrats. This is waving the bloody shirt by claiming they were all Confederates at heart. Quote, every man that tried to destroy this nation was a Democrat. The man that assassinated Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat. Soldiers, every scar you have on your heroic bodies was given to you by a Democrat. That's called waving the bloody shirt. And so it did have an impact, and it would continue for decades after even this.
And George, earlier we talked about moving along the campaign trail. We talked about that political cartoon from Thomas Nast, and you feature two more for us to take a look at here in this presentation. So what do they depict, and what do they say of these times?
So Thomas Nast was perhaps the most important and influential cartoonist from the time of the Civil War on for a number of years. And a few years back, I actually visited his house and studio in New Jersey. But he was a diehard Republican. There was no doubt whose side he was on. So his cartoons really could be very sympathetic to the Republicans and really lashing out at the Democrats. The one on the left is probably most interesting in terms of what I saw during the campaign itself. You have Boss Tweed leading the group towards St. Louis, going to St. Louis. That's where the Democratic Convention was. If you notice, every one of these folks has a ribbon on that says reform, and because it was the Democrats' main theme. But again, you have Boss Tweed, who was everybody in the country knew was corrupt. There's a Catholic priest behind him that says reform on his hat, but it also says death to public schools. There was an Indian behind that representing Tammany Hall and the corruption of the Democratic Party. And then in the back, the KKK is lurking, and they have reform on their hat too. So this is Nast saying, don't believe the reform. Look at these, people that are supporting the Democrats, the corrupt and the Catholics and the KKK, who he was all, he was sure that the public would respond with revulsion to the type of people that he was writing or drawing about, who were supporting Tilden. And then on the right-hand side, somewhat more benign but yet powerful cartoon, and you have kind of the little man in the middle, the voter, looking very nervous because he's being menaced by this man dressed in a Confederate uniform. And on his other side is a man dressed in the post-war Union veterans outfit, the GAR, behind whom is the Capitol and the American flag. So the symbolism is very clear there that the Democrats are menacing the voters and the Republicans are backing the country, the flag, and the Capitol.
So George, the results, the controversy, let's take a look at that because we started an early part of this conversation looking at the Electoral College.
Right. So this is this becomes a real nightmare on the night of the vote. Tilden comes in carrying the popular vote, and by a fairly wide margin for the time, over 300,000 votes ahead, or about 300,000 votes ahead. But he fell short of the Electoral College by 1 vote. 82% of Americans voted. That's the highest number of percentage-wise of any election in American history. Most of the southern states were still under some form of Union Army occupation, enforcing what was the Reconstruction. And key amongst that was allowing the former slaves the right to vote. And there was a lot of intimidation going on in the South, from both the Democrats and the Republicans, but mostly the Democrats attempting to keep the blacks at home from allowing their exercise. This was the first presidential election that former Confederate officers were allowed to vote. So there were 3 key states here. You can see South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. And those results, what you see in green was Tilden, what you see in pink is Hayes. And those 3 states looked close on election night. Well, so what happens is that into the Republican Party headquarters in New York City walks a man by the name of Dan Sickles. Dan Sickles was a former Union general, lost his leg at the Battle of Gettysburg, was absolutely a corrupt partisan. There's no question about it. Well, Zachariah Chandler was drunk and not around. Sickles walks into headquarters, actually comes in with his peg leg, but walks into headquarters and sees that the election is going the wrong way. So he also sees that these 3 southern states, which are all under Republican military governors and military control, he will wire the secretaries of state who control the elections in all 3 of those states with this. Sickles will, he said, with your state sure for Hayes, he is elected. Hold your state. Now think about that. So then what happens is that ballots start to be simply thrown out. Enough ballots basically were not counted in those 3 southern states to ensure Hayes's victory. Now remember, there are a lot of blacks who absolutely would have voted for Hayes throughout much of the South, but many of them had been driven away from the polls, or they're in those polling places where the military wasn't standing there. A lot of the black voters, simply their ballots were cast aside. So the whole southern region, it was a completely corrupt thing. And I've heard another lecturer that talked about this, that said if the blacks had been able to truly vote away from from threats of violence, that Hayes would have won several more southern states. Well, as it turned out, those three key states were where the election gets turned, and it becomes something that begins to turn very violent. There are rumors of a new civil war. President Grant had to send more troops in to quell civil violence. Again, does that sound familiar? And so the Democrats strongly objected to what had gone on in those three states. So much so that the whole legitimacy of the election was in doubt.
And George, we've seen elections go to the Supreme Court before. This one does not. Rather, it's decided through an unwritten deal, informally agreed upon by United States congressmen.
Right. So the only reason that the election in 2000 went to the Supreme Court was because of how the ballots were being counted in one state. It theoretically goes to the Congress, but during this period of time, it was sent to an election commission. Congress punted. They set up an election commission. 5 members from the democratically controlled House, 5 members from the Republican Senate, 4 members from the Supreme Court, 2 appointed by Republicans, 2 appointed by Democrats, and 1 of the Supreme Court justices who was truly neutral. Well, I guess the pressure got to him and he backed out. So the Republican Senate pushed through another Republican Supreme Court justice, and it turned out that the Election Commission said that they would upheld the electoral votes going to Hayes by an 8-7 result. So that would become a major point of contention. The Democrats, again, refused to go along. And you can see on the left-hand side, you see a whip and a gun pointed at who you would expect to be a civilian on the other side. And it says Tilden or blood. There were all kinds of threats going on. The Klan and the White League in the South were fomenting trouble. You can see on the right-hand side the old wounded rather than the robust elephant. And, it's kind of the graveyard of the Republican Party. So what happens, they go through from November 8th all the way to March 2nd. And if you, up through the elections of FDR, we would typically have an inauguration day, not on January 20th, but on March 4th. So the Republicans who controlled the returning boards simply threw out enough votes. The Democrats cried foul. President Grant, as I mentioned, had to send in extra troops. In the end, the Electoral Commission split, and there still was no consensus. What happened was, though, that the Democrats in Congress, along with the Republicans outside of this Electoral Commission, decided to cut a deal. And the compromise would end the threats of violence in the South and Civil War. It was a dirty deal because the Southerners pledged they would no longer contest the election results if Hayes was to agree to pull out the federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. Plus, he would appoint at least one Southerner to his cabinet. Back then, the cabinet was a lot more important. And on the other hand, the Democrats then promised that they too would respect the rights of the blacks in the South, allowing them to continue to vote. And of course, once the federal troops left, that went away completely. But the deal was Democrats would back down from filibustering the election results. And they literally came to that compromise 2 days before the inauguration. And so Hayes dutifully ended Reconstruction, pulled out the federal troops, and it would have a lasting impact.
You took the words right out of my mouth, George. You know, we see this impact not just being for this election, but for, you know, shaping the country's narrative for the next 100 years to come. And you know, in the short term, outgo the Republican carpetbaggers and uprise the Redeemer Democrats. But we see this having an impact over the next 100 years.
Yes, and it really did set the stage for Jim Crow, Black disenfranchisement, which means the blacks in the South losing the ability to vote, Jim Crow being segregation. Again, if you look at the cartoon, and you know the cartoons are the great internet of the 1800s, you see on the right hand side of the first cartoon, you see the KKK. Of course, he's got a dagger and a gun, and he's shaking hands with a guy from the White League, which was another white supremacist violent organization. They're shaking hands over a skull and crossbones, and if you read closely enough, it says the Union as it was, and then it says underneath the skull and crossbones, worse than slavery. So you have this black family intimidated, cowering, and you have the white Southerners supreme in their control of the South once again. And this led, you know, there more Supreme Court appointments and whatnot. It led to the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal is equal. Of course, it never was equal, it was always separate. And it wasn't until 1954 when the Supreme Court overturned Plessy in Brown versus Board of Education, which led a decade later to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So from 1876 to the 1960s, the results of this election was creation of a second-class laborers and non-voters in the blacks in the South, with the whites being the supreme upper class, the leaders, the ones that you know, could rise and control the capital. And it was, you know, it disenfranchised millions of black citizens in the South.
George, I've got to ask, those brokering the deal, trying to just get through the outcome of that election, did they at all anticipate that there would be this level of ramification and impact in their decision-making process? That is, were they just short-sighted in trying to get the deal done before that March deadline? Did they know this was what was coming down the pike?
You're asking me to speculate. I would say that the Northerners, the Republicans in the North, number one, they were the Northerners in general were very weary of Reconstruction. It was expensive. They wanted the boys to come home. It was not popular in the North. So it was a way to end something that was unpopular. It was a way to bring taxes down in an era where they're still feeling the effects of an economic depression. And I think they just wanted to get the heck out. And the Democrats, well, Tilden, of course, would never run for office again. But if he had come in, and they certainly would have ended Reconstruction too, but perhaps not in this manner. This essentially gave the Southern Democrats, many of them, who would spend the next couple of decades in power, essentially to eliminate all the benefits of the three constitutional amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, except they couldn't have the blacks back in slavery, but they created an atmosphere for sharecropping and arresting people on legitimate charges and then having them work off their fines, in the field for no money, slavery by any other name. I think many of the Southern Democrats knew exactly what they were going to be doing. And I think the Republicans were so browbeaten and weary and hoping just to get that presidency back, they essentially turn the other cheek to it.
So George, as I take time to scroll through your bibliography slides, so folks watching along at home can get a chance to look at where you got this material from, I'll leave you with one last question. Looking back at all we covered in the impact of the 1876 election, what do you think are the most important takeaways folks should remember from this presentation, that election?
Well, number one, I think that the takeaway is that we have a long history of contentious presidential elections and a history of corrupt presidential elections. Not everyone was contentious, and certainly not everyone was corrupt. But when we tend to be presentists, and the media is so focused on what is happening today, and don't take a long look, we may not realize that some of the same problems we face today, history has seen before and should have taught us a lesson. And then besides that, I think the other big takeaway was that the direct result of this election being the end of Reconstruction did allow the door to be wide open for the destruction, I guess, of civil rights in the South for the next century. So those are the two takeaways of history that I see.
George, I think those are such important takeaways, and it's important for us to rewind that tape of history and to be able to go and look back on who we have been as a people, how we have worked through crises, and what it's take to do that, particularly when it comes to our presidential elections. I think we have, sometimes we may be guilty of the immediate satisfaction or the weight of the now, where we feel like we are living through some of the toughest times. And certainly, if I took anything away from this, those living through 1876 were certainly living through some darn tough times.
Well, I think you're right, and I appreciate the opportunity to teach a little political history with some perspective right before this contentious presidential election.
And we will look for that outcome. And of course, Mr. George Deutsch, we're going to look for you to come back. If we do have the opportunity, I'd love to be able to dive into those other elections that you highlighted at the beginning, a chance to look at those, as well as other elections you've covered in your numerous presentations, lectures across 7 states, as well as the District of Columbia. So Mr. George Deutsch, thank you so much for taking the time, energy, and effort to join us and share your insight and knowledge with us here today.
Thank you, Ben, and remind everybody, get out and vote.
Absolutely. Do your civic duty. Go and practice democracy. We encourage you to go and vote. And of course, if you need more information about voting and where to vote and how to vote, you can head to websites such as vote.org, vote411.org, 2 great resources. And of course, wherever you are living, if you're watching with us here in Erie County, Pennsylvania, you can find information from your local folks here. But if you're somewhere else tuning in, anywhere throughout the country, you can find information from your local municipality. So do go and vote. And we look forward to bringing George back. We look forward to welcoming you back. Thank you all for tuning in to watching along at home, whether you're watching live on the Jefferson's Facebook page or a later broadcast of this. We appreciate your support. We appreciate your encouragement, and especially patience when sometimes things don't go always as planned. George, thanks for being such a great sport, sticking through, working through the tech difficulties. Folks watching, thanks for sticking with us too. George, I had it up there on the slide, but for anybody looking for more information to contact you or the work that you do at the Hagen History Center, to where shall we point them?
Well, our Hagen History Center, my email there is gdeutsch, tsch@eriehistory.org, or our website. You can click to me from our website, which is eriehistory.org.
Thank you for that, George. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and discussions, you can tune to jeserie.org. Their past discussions are available for live on-demand streaming. You can watch past presentations from today's presenter, as well as a whole range of other folks we've welcomed to present, and you'll find our calendar with upcoming events. We'll be sure to keep you posted about that, including one where we'll welcome back Mr. George Deutsch and the Erie Civil War Roundtable. That'll be happening on November 17th. We're looking forward to that. More information on our website, as well as the Hagen History Center website on that. And of course, you'll also find publications on our website, plenty to keep you busy and keep you informed and to keep you part of this conversation as we move forward. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.